starting right now. And I am going to pass it over to Dan Allen here at OU, who will introduce this week's speaker. So take it away.
Hi, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Dan Allen. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Albert Ruhi. Albert, he's a dear friend and a good collaborator of mine. He got his PhD in 2012 at the Institute of Aquatic Ecology at the University of Girona in Spain. Afterwards, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Arizona State University, which is where I met him. He and I actually had the same postdoc advisor there, John Sabo. And then after that, he went to do a very prestigious postdoctoral fellowship at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, or otherwise known as the SEEC, at the University of Maryland. And since 2018, he's been an assistant professor at the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at the University of California, Berkeley, one of the top universities in the world. So Albert has a great publication record. He's published in journals such as Science, Proceedings of the North American Academy of Sciences, Frontiers in Ecology and Environment, Biological Conservation, Global Change Biology. He really is a rock star. He does really, really great research. He's also a PI on our collaborative macrosystems NSF-funded research project called Stream Climbs. And so the last time I actually traveled was to visit Albert in California. So it's been a while, I guess, since I've traveled. That's always what I think of as the last time I saw Albert. So we had hoped to have him here in our spring. He was invited, but of course the seminar was canceled due to the COVID pandemic. And so we're pleased to host him virtually. So without anything else, please let's welcome Dr. Albert Ruhi, and who's going to give the seminar. And I'll let you introduce the title, Albert.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan, for this very generous, almost undeserved introduction. I'm really excited to give this talk here at OU. Of course, I just hope it could be in person. I'm going to talk about river flows and how flow regimes change, and how can we use time series analysis to study this phenomenon and hopefully preserve biodiversity. This is the focus of my research program. The research program in my lab, we study how streams and wetlands respond to this changing environment, mostly climate variability and drought, but also human stressors like dams. And today I would like to start this talk with one photo. This photo of the Colorado River Delta down in Mexico. This is how the Delta has looked like since the 1930s when Hoover Dam went up. And this is how it looked for 8 glorious weeks in spring 2014, when it flowed all the way to the Gulf of California. So there was an amendment to the water treaty between Mexico and the US that allowed opening the floodgates, okay? And they created what they called the pulse flow. It was stimulating a large flood. Now that flood represented about less than 1% of the annual stream flow of the Colorado River. So not that much, but it did restore some riparian habitats and received a tremendous community response there in Mexico. At that point in 2014, I was a postdoc at ASU, like Dan mentioned. I just arrived from Spain, and I had no idea that the Colorado was mostly dry, had been dry for decades. So I was pretty stoked to learn and also witness that great whole ecosystem, large-scale experiment. But of course, the reality is that weeks later, it was running dry again. So you may wonder, how is it that many rivers, large and small, suffer from water scarcity or the inability to meet human and ecosystem demands? Well, one of the reasons is that water scarcity is really widespread. It affects every continent and around 3 billion people around the world, at least 1 month per year. So here in yellow, this is a figure from the Boros-Marty et al. 2010 Nature paper, where they mapped water scarcity and whether scarcity threatens biodiversity or human water security, or both, right? So in yellow, you can see the areas where scarcity threatens biodiversity, and you see that they are like in all continents. However, these regions that are in red, so water scarcity is threatening both water security for humans and for nature. So these risks are overlapping, which poses a much more significant challenge. And importantly, ongoing global warming will make things worse. We know that even under optimistic scenarios, aridity, and here it's measured as the moisture in the topsoil, so we know that it's expected to increase anywhere between 5 and 15% by the end of the century. And this increased aridity will be particularly severe in some regions that are already dry or water scarce. You can see here in the American West and Southwest in particular, how all the models converge in predicting increased dryness, aridity, which means that our freshwater ecosystems, particularly in these regions, will be under increased risk. It's also important to remember that our freshwater ecosystems are at risk, not just because they are having less water, but also because they have altered variability. Okay, so the water, in this case, the stream flow, over time, it has some structure, and these structures are being altered. Here, I'm showing an example of the Colorado River, which has a great record. And I know that this plot can be a bit complex. This is a wavelet, is a time series method that we can use to understand the frequency domain, so how frequencies are in a flow regime in this case, and how they change over time. So I'm going to walk you through this plot. The x-axis is time, right? This is, we are showing about the century worth of data of mean daily discharge. The y-axis here, it's period or scale. Okay, we can look at different scales of variation, from very short scales, meaning high frequencies, to very long scales or long frequencies. And the third dimension here is color. This is wavelet power, and what is telling us is whether that particular scale at that particular point in time was important or not. Okay, so the red color means very important, means that that flow regime could be expressed as a function of flow cycles, flow variability at that particular scale. And you see that even if we don't know much about this river, we would be able to tell right away that something important happened after 1962, right after, right? And of course, what happened is that a huge dam, Glen Canyon Dam, which impounded Lake Powell, was built. And you see that just before the dam, we can see these strong seasonal and annual cycles in the flow. Maybe it's a snow melt, like dry or like low flows after that. It may be a combination of different drivers, but the fact is that these natural scales were dampened after the dam was built, and all this variation now we have pushed it to the faster scales, to the human relevant scales. So now everything happens at a weekly scale, or even the yield or sub-daily. So we don't have just less water, we also have them distributed in a very artificial way. So if a natural flow regime has some levels of seasonal variation, ups and downs, and also some interannual variation, because we have dry years and wet years, what we are observing more frequently is these altered flow regimes. And there are different characteristics. This is like a syndrome. Sometimes we see that high flows are muted because the floods are no longer allowed to flow downstream. They are captured in the reservoirs. So we see that these high flows are muted. In many cases, we see that stream flows show a very, very strong trend, significant trends. Most often, these are negative trends. And in some cases, because we still have some variation at the seasonal level, we see that that some extreme flows that are very rare in the historical period now cause perennial systems to become intermittent. And that regime shift is really important, we'll see. We also see altered periodicity, meaning that these scales of variation, like I was showing you using that wavelet, have shifted, and now we have still variance, but happening at a very weird, non-natural scale. So, of course, organisms have evolved under the natural flow regime, not this new altered flow regime. So there's this range of adaptations, life history, behavioral, morphological adaptations that now could be decoupled from the regime that shaped them. And my question is whether we can understand how freshwater communities respond to these novel flow regimes. Of course, I am not the first to ask this question. There's been a lot of research on this topic over decades. Something that I would like to mention, though, is that most research has been at the lower levels of biological organization, so populations, and most often focusing on particular events, extreme events. Maybe it's a particular hurricane or drought, not so much communities responding to regimes. And I want to emphasize both sides of this story. I think it's important to focus on communities and food webs because we know that species interact with each other. We know that there are trade-offs. We know that biotic interactions can dampen or can amplify the effects of disturbance and stress. So in that sense, the whole food web may not be the sum of the parts that we would think if we study species in a vacuum. The other side is regimes, right? We could study event by event, but there's some properties like seasonality, predictability, signal and noise that we can only understand when we put all these events in relation to each other. So when we have long-term data, that's something we can do. And of course, again, I'm not the first to realize that. There's research really interesting in the 80s showing how an event of a similar magnitude will have really different consequences, ecological consequences, depending on when it occurs, right? Because we need to understand, how this event relates to phenology. And Vince Resch had this really nice paper on disturbance in extreme ecosystems that made this point very clearly. So my focus is on how communities respond to regimes. I combine my lab now combines different approaches, modeling of long-term data. We do a lot using gauging hydrological data. We also do some field experiments. That's something more new for me. I will show you a field experiment we completed last year. But we tend to combine these different approaches because sometimes it's when you see like control and realism that you can see the full picture. So that's what we try to do. So with that as an introduction, this is what I'm gonna talk about today. I'm gonna tell you two short stories about the ways in which flow regime alteration can affect communities. First, community replacement, meaning native, non-native covariation, and how flow regime can mediate that, who's the winner, who's the loser. And the second story is on dynamics of traits. So again, which traits may be selected for or against when we alter a flow regime and what that means in terms of the community, not just individual species. So this is mostly postdoctoral work. This second piece of work I finished when I started my position at Berkeley, but it's not yet the new research program at Berkeley. I will end by showing you some ideas that we have started exploring with my new team, which I'm very excited about. We have a really great team of postdocs and PhD students, and we are building on some of these questions and also exploring some new questions. So the first story is about the natural flow regime and whether by altering the flow regime, we may open opportunities for non-natives to establish and potentially spread, okay? There's a lot of theory showing that environmental resistance is a main driver or a main control of invasion. It prevents invasions. Here I just draw this cartoon, making this point. If we have a natural hydrograph, most of the time we should expect that these, natural high and low flows should keep non-natives at bay. And therefore, if we are interested in the native component, it should be pretty easy to understand why the native component responds to the environment, right? Because it's mostly abiotic. However, when we study a system that has been altered, and many of the rivers you may know and we'll see today have been fundamentally altered, sometimes we may be opening new niches. So this environmental resistance is not as strong. Non-natives, in some cases, may establish, may spread. So natives receive this negative influence of both changing or altered environment, and the non-natives that maybe just happen to match this novel environment. So if our question is what's driving the native component of biodiversity, that becomes a tricky question, right? Because if we study it over space, we will find that watersheds and rivers that are well preserved tend to be more represented by natives, and those that are more altered, they are more invaded. But we really don't know what's driving what. So are the natives responding to flow or to the flow mediated effects of non-natives? And this seems like an easy question, but it's really hard to tackle in nature. And I will show you a potential solution. Of course, it has limitations like any solution, but with long-term data, you can kind of get at the mechanism. And this is what we did using a combination of methods. I will not go like really into detail, but I will show you how these methods are useful and maybe can shed some light in this complicated dynamics. This is how we would generally study a flow regime, right? Like we have been doing this for a while, where we decide what's the threshold, and anything above that threshold is a high flow or a flood. Anything below is a low flow. And we don't really take into account whether these events happen in the high or the low flow season. What we did in this paper, and we have been using and building on what John Sabo published in 2008. It's this method, the Fourier analysis, to understand what are the dominant frequencies in the environment. This is important in flow regimes because by identifying the frequencies, we can reconstruct this seasonal profile, this expectation that probably has shaped adaptations in organisms. And then we can compare individual records of flow, in this case, all these small dots, to the expectation, right? And this difference, this can be an anomaly or a departure from expected. So then in a way, we can use these anomalies to try predict community dynamics. I will not show formulas here, but just so you know, we are using these MARS models, multivariate autoregressive state space. They are multivariate because we can consider several species at the same time, and there are two different matrices. We can model the effects of one species on each other and the effects of the environment on each of the species. So again, we can ask this question of whether species are responding to flow or to flow mediated effects on competitors. We applied this combination of methods on long-term data from the upper Verde River, which is really a beautiful river in northern Arizona. I had the privilege to study. We were using long-term data collected by the U.S. Forest Service, and the community is interesting because it's mixed. It has almost the same number of native to non-native species, and there's no dam. There's some hydrological alteration, as we'll see. We saw that some winters were way drier recently than they had been in the past, and that prompted us to ask this question, whether natives and non-natives were responding in similar ways or not, and whether they were interacting as a consequence of that. So we had daily discharge for many years, so we could use this Fourier method to understand the predictable signals. So signal, anything else is noise, right? So we are asking how signal and noise drives these community dynamics to, again, answer this question of abiotic versus biotic drivers. So we fitted these models, and this is the result. Okay, these are the coefficients on the left side of the slide. You can see that most of these biotic interactions are pretty close to zero. Okay, there's some significant effect of non-native species on native species, but otherwise these biotic effects are not that important. If you compare that to the right side of the slide, we see that flow anomalies were a major driver, particularly low flows, right? Low flows had this significant and very large negative effect on the native species, not so much on the non-natives. High flow anomalies, and remember these are anomalies, not just high or low flows per se. When we are talking about low flow anomalies, these mostly happen in the winter. So this means drier winters than expected, relative to the historical record. So we see that low flows were the main driver. Here you can compare effects, and what we found is that these low flow anomaly effects was much stronger, more than 4 times stronger than the non-native effects. This, of course, is considering the whole community, right? But each species could respond in different ways, and we also asked whether there was some specificity. We found that some native species responded a lot more than some others, and particularly these that are of conservation concern. So we knew that these were more likely to respond because this may be linked to reproduction. These 3 species reproduce in January to April, so we thought that drier winters could affect particularly the native component and these early species that reproduce early in the season. Only one non-native seemed to be benefited from low flows. This was the green sunfish. Many of these sunfish species like stable conditions really thrive below beaver dams. So it was not a surprise either to see that some did respond in the opposite way than natives. So this we did some other analysis in the same paper related to biodiversity, but this answered really the main question, and we could answer that the environment flow regime alteration was the main driver here of community replacement. Of course, we didn't know if this was a result contingent on this one river system on the Verde, or if it was a bigger phenomenon going on in the Southwest. And to test for the generality of these patterns, we assembled a much larger data set, collaborating with state and federal agencies and the tribal nations in Arizona, and the USGS, which has this amazing hydrometric network. By doing that, we were able to consider 10 rivers, not just one, and also a range of stressors. So now it's not just climate, like some streams are affected by dams and culverts or diversions, so a range of stressors. What we found is that across the board, flow anomalies were declining, okay? And this is not flow per se, again, this is a trend in flow anomalies. If there's a negative trend in flow anomalies, what that means is that the flow regimes have been becoming more stable, okay? So we wanted, which is really in agreement with what we saw in the Verde River. So we asked the same question, whether this ongoing flow stabilization was an important driver of fish community replacement, which we know is happening. And we combined the same methods. Okay, so I will not describe again this Fourier analysis. What we did that was a bit different is that now we were pulling the anomalies by year. So we could say whether a particular year was wetter or drier than expected. And more importantly, we could look for trends in these annual anomalies. And then we ran the same MARS, the same community models like we did previously, but then we added some a new step, and we use these MARS models. They are stochastic, they are time series models. They are really used they come from econometrics, but they are widely used in fishery science. We also use them to forecast, and we forecasted community trajectories under 2 different scenarios. The first scenario was that this flow anomaly trend will continue. So it assumes that what we have seen over these past 3 decades we will continue to see at least for the next decade. Okay. Of course, we don't know if that's going to be the case or not. So we also simulated a more conservative scenario, which is that we are already in a worst case scenario. Like anomalies are not going to continue decreasing. They will just stay where they are. And then because we simulated this community, so the abundance of each species in each community, in each river, under these two scenarios, we could calculate the risk. We estimated something called quasi-extinction risk, which is the probability that that the species will cross a critical decline threshold. In this case, 80%, which is a threshold that IUCN has used to list the species. And because we are simulating under both scenario A, so trends continue, scenario B, trends are going to halt, then we can compare risk under both the scenarios. And this difference, this delta risk, it's what we call trend effects. So I will just show you the final plot of this analysis. On the left here, these are native species. On the right, they are non-native. And the y-axis shows risk. Okay, these dots are actual risk, so quasi-extinction risk, and the bars show the trend effect. So if the trend effect is positive, it means that the trends, the ongoing trends, this flow stabilization, is increasing risk. If they are negative, it means that they are injuring, so they would do better under this changing environment than under the historical one. So we see that there's a huge variation right across the species, also across systems, given each species. I mean, many of these species we could model for different streams or rivers. But we ran some models and we saw that some consistent patterns emerged. In general, natives had a higher quasi-extinction risk under this novel flow regime than non-natives. And non-natives, actually, the risk was negative, meaning that these trend effects, so these trends in the anomalies decreasing and the flow regime becoming more and more stable, that was actually helping most of the non-native species. Okay, so that was the answer. We wanted to try and understand why was that, right? Because you could assume that native species should be really should do well under variable flow regimes, and maybe should be already adapted. So so why is it that they are faring worse than non-natives? We found that many of these non-natives that were doing really well were so-called equilibrium strategists, and these species have late maturity, low fecundity, and high parental care. So these species tend to like actually like really stable flows, not seasonal, not variable or stochastic, but very stable. So these species tend to do well below dams in streams that don't flood often anymore. On the other hand, we have species that are periodic, and some of them were endangered, and we were able to to link these changes in flow regime to their risk. So that's the spike days, and here on the right there's the non-native bulkhead. These are pretty common across these streams. So again, the same story at a larger spatial scale across the Southwest. We found a pretty consistent message that flow regimes are changing, and that's driving replacement. The last step on in this research area was developed by Liz Comte. She's a former postdoc in the lab and now an assistant professor at Illinois State. She did similar analysis, a bit more sophisticated even, using wavelets across the US, okay, using a lot of hydrological data for about 1,100 watersheds or sub-watersheds, hackets across the US, and then using long-term records of fish from NatureServe, from the non-native aquatic species and data set, from USGS, etc. So what we found is that invadedness, and this is a ratio. So here we are expressing this as a ratio because otherwise you'll find that areas with more, so with higher native richness are also areas with higher non-native richness, right? This creates this counterintuitive Simpson's paradox. So you need to control for both, and this may be driven by, watershed area or habitat heterogeneity, etc. So when you actually plot the ratio, you see whether the non-native or the native component is favored, and we see that there were really stark patterns. That was not so much a novelty. We knew that the west, 100, like left of the 100 meridian, the dry part of the continent is really more invaded. What was more interesting and perhaps less expected is that different life history strategies would be differentially selected for in different regions. And we found that these areas in the Midwest tended to favor periodic non-native strategies, and some other areas where equilibrium and opportunistic were the winners. So we were able to link this to spatial variation in how flow regimes have been altered. Okay, we looked at a bunch of metrics, but these two really capture what's going on. Flow variability, this is just a coefficient of variation. Okay, so we found that flow regimes have become more stable, really, so less variable. In most of the country, there's of course a spatial variation, but you see that most subwatersheds are on the blue side of this spectrum. Flow seasonality, on the other hand, is more patchy. Many watersheds have increased in seasonality, some others have decreased. What we saw is that watersheds that had been consistently decreasing in variability, so dampening flows, had higher probabilities of showing high invadedness values, or they were more invaded. And not just in general, but in particular with these equilibrium strategies that I showed you in the second study. Something that was even more interesting is that we also explored interactions. So this is one of the hypotheses, one of the mechanisms of invasion, the environmental resistance or abiotic resistance hypothesis of invasion. There's another one, which is propagular pressure, right? Some watersheds are maybe more invaded because there's more human activity, maybe folks fish using bait and they introduce fish, or there are maybe intentional releases, pet trade. There's so many factors. What we found is that using different proxies for propagular pressure, that would interact with flow seasonality and variability. So if a watershed had been altered, so has a much more stable flow than it should, and was subject to high propagular pressure, then invadedness would increase much faster on the low side. So you need some minimum propagular pressure level in order for flow alteration to have some effect on invadedness. So that was interesting in that usually this research, previous research on larger scale patterns of invasion tend to focus on one hypothesis, and here we wanted to see if there were interactions between the mechanisms. So we found one. And to wrap up this first message about flow regime, well, we confirmed that flow regime change is important, and that non-natives can be often passengers of change more than drivers of change. This is important in fish, as I have shown, but it transcends fish, right? There's so much research on, for example, on tamarisk versus cottonwood, and what was often interpreted as out-competition of tamarisk out-competing cottonwood. Actually, some research also showed that when flow regimes are altered and we don't have flood pulses anymore and water tables go down, we are favoring tamarisk. So this underlying environment may be helping non-natives and harming natives, and creating this illusion in some cases that non-natives are outcompeting natives, when it's actually the novel environment that's driving this replacement. So this is the conclusion of the first part of my talk. Now I would like to move to the second story about how communities change when they are subject to a very artificial flow regime, but one that fluctuates. Okay, and we are going to use dams, hydropower dams, as a natural experiment. I like dams. Well, I don't like dams per se, but I like using them as a natural experiment because I think it's so strong, the effects, that it's it's really interesting to see how communities respond to time varying alteration. And this is a dam in Georgia, Buford Dam, in the Chattahoochee River. I was in Georgia. I went to finish my PhD, and I have been collaborating with Daryl Badger at UGA since then. This is still one collaboration with him. This was not part of my PhD. But the idea here is that dams, we saw alter seasonality. So we no longer have these seasonal high and low flows. But something that we usually miss is that they can also introduce these novel signals in the environment, right? And this is a very extreme case. Many hydro-peaking dams have these diel cycles. In this case, you see that it's almost 1 order of magnitude if you compare low to high flow. So 1 order of magnitude of variation. What you would see generally in a year, now you see within every single day. And not just that, but you have this very artificial, again, like pauses between weeks. Okay, so there's these weekends that you can track, and even vacation days, right? In this case, I was really surprised when we plotted the flow regime and you could track vacation days because hydropower or power demand is lower, so then they don't release as much. So you can really track the human work week using these flow regimes. And the question became, okay, how are invertebrate communities responding to this? It's not always like this, okay? In some cases, it's high hydro-peaking some seasons not as much. And because we have this time varying alteration, we can see whether communities are tracking that or not, or to what extent. And that's what we did using similar methods to the ones I described, using Mars models, and characterizing the community, the invertebrate community, seasonal data over 12 years. We characterize that using traits, okay? Remember that traits, there's so many different ways to look at the community using traits, and they can be informative in that they tell us something about the mechanism that's driving, extirpations. So we classified invertebrates using these 35 traits, on body morphology, on dispersal, volatilism, size, reproduction, feeding, etc. What we found is that many traits were loser traits, okay? If this trait is below this 0 dashed line, what it means is that high hydro-peaking reduces the abundance of that trait, okay? So all these red traits are loser traits. These 3 traits were the only winner traits, meaning that high hydro-peaking was correlated. We think that caused an increase in these traits. Many of them didn't, or a few of them didn't respond. But the interesting thing here is that traits in a given species will have many traits, right? And there are trade-offs. So here there are essentially many ways in which you can lose, right? And very few ways to win. So it's very likely that you will have some trait that's a loser trait, even if not all the traits that you have are loser traits. And that's what we see when we look at the community from a functional diversity standpoint. So we see that the community was responding very negatively to hydro-peaking, more than you would expect by, like analyzing trait by trait. And this is because, many species had some trait that was selected against under this high hydro-peaking. And again, we can use these methods, like I showed you that we can simulate under drought scenarios. We can also use them to simulate under different hydro-peaking intensities. And this, I don't mean to propose this as a new way to operate the dam, but it can give us some indication of what would happen, how would risk change if we were to ameliorate the hydro-peaking scenario. So in this case, we played with different scenarios of ameliorating or intensifying this hydro-peaking and over different horizons, okay? Like what does it happen if you do it for only half a year, 1 year, 2, 4 years? And of course, risk, in this case, it's again this probability of collapse, of crossing I think here it was a 90% threshold of functional diversity. So that risk would respond both to how strong hydropicking is or how ameliorated you decide it should be, and for how long, right? So the longer, the more benefits should deliver. So this is in agreement with other research coming from the Colorado River by Ted Kennedy and others. They have tackled the mechanism in a very smart way. I really like this paper where they propose that there's this recruitment limitation where insects cannot, so viability of their eggs goes down when there's hydropicking because of this artificial, this artificial tidal zone. And they showed that with, like, in a very convincing way with mayflies. Some other parts of their community are not affected, right? Like all these mostly crustaceans, mollusks, water mites, oligochaetes are not as affected. So what other authors have found is that when they compare dams that differ in hydropicking intensity, is that you tend to have nested subsets of the community. The insects, some of the insects are the first ones to go, and you end up with these degraded communities. And that, of course, can have important effects for terrestrial food webs and aerial food webs, bats and riparian birds. If there's hydropicking, you should expect these flags of immersion insects to decrease. So it should really be studied. I think it's a very interesting area of research, and it goes beyond the Chattahoochee or the Colorado. Here we did some larger scale analysis of flow regimes and periodicity, and we found that across the Southeast, that these artificial time scales, okay, these cycles at weird frequencies at 12 hours, 24 hours, 1 week, were way more important in dam affected rivers than in reference. Okay, this is a climatic network of gauges, meaning that these are really pristine rivers. We found that these frequencies were not as important. So we really have these widespread altered periodicities, which means that maybe, by imposing these human rhythms on natural systems, we are also selecting for some traits, and this could have not just ecological but also evolutionary responses, which really have not been described yet. But I think it's a really, fascinating area of research. Just to wrap up, like, we found that flow variability was actually pretty high. So it's not that these systems need to be stable; they can be variable, but it's just this variability is expressed at artificial timescales. So this is the second message that I wanted to give you today. It's one about the frequency domain, which is sometimes something a bit like hard to wrap up your mind. Now I would like to show you some of the projects that we just started at Berkeley. I don't have solid results yet. They are very much in the same general area about flow regimes and how communities and food webs respond to them. But we are trying to bring in spatial extent. So how, does it matter that different sites are part of a network, or does it matter the network topology? Does it matter that some sites may be connected seasonally by flow while some others are isolated? So we know that dispersal and habitat spatial structure can explain some of these flow ecology relationships I talked about. So now I'm trying to bring this component here. So we are exploring this with Dan and other collaborators, Meryl Mims, Mike Bogan, as part of this NSF macrosystems project. At Berkeley, we are monitoring one network in Pinnacles National Park, and we are studying if drying disturbance and connectivity interact. Okay, like maybe you can have very strong drought locally, but because the sites are connected seasonally, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe communities can bounce back pretty fast, right? And we published a proof of concept paper here showing that maybe there's this idea of keystone community, okay, a community that will rescue the other communities in the network. And we are studying this, as I said, in Shalone Creek watershed in Pinnacles National Park. It's a very pretty park. It's very warm, so if you decide to explore, don't go in August like I did for the first time. But something that's cool is that it's a very complex network and has sites, in across different orders, stream orders, and also below and above a few perennial pools that they are caves. Okay, so these caves preserve water year round. So then you can really see what part of the community is persisting there and how that community helps, the meta community recover when the rewetting phase comes. We ran some field experiments. Now I wanted to show you very briefly a video. So this site had been dry since May 2019. So for over half a year, and we set up these traps. This is former postdoc in the lab, Guillermo de Mendoza. We set up these traps that are supposed to capture invertebrates that recolonize via different pathways. So some of them, I will speed this up, some of them will fly and colonize. So here you see that the water is coming back. This is the rewetting front. So some of them will recolonize aerially. Some of them will drift downstream. Some of them may swim upstream. Some of them may be surviving in the hyperreich, so may do these vertical migrations. So these traps would allow, or would prevent rather, invertebrates from all except one direction. So then, and we replicated this across the network, so now we can know, and we don't have results yet, we're hiring a new postdoc to work on this project. We will know really what's the individual contribution of each dispersal pathway. So what controls resilience in this system. And you see that in over a few hours, really like water came back. I'm gonna fast forward, but it was really awesome to see, water come back after the system being dry for 6 months or more. And over the following weeks, we saw invertebrates colonizing both the stream and our traps. So it was really interesting to actually, perform this experiment. A similar experiment had been done in the 70s. And now we brought this network perspective. So this is one of the projects. The second one, I will describe it briefly, is led by Kyle Leathers, a PhD student in the lab. And it's about climate change and how early a snow melt, so again, a flow regime change, how that may affect the food webs. Okay, the food webs, these are experimental food webs. We controlled the flow regime that should peak in August. We manipulated that so it would peak in July or even in June. Okay, so and this is really like in agreement with the expectations by the end of the century. It could advance 60 days or more. So we had these experimental channels at SNARL, the Sierra Nevada Aquatic Research Lab. That's close to Bishop in the Eastern Sierra, really beautiful place. We had these channels, very large flow-through channels, and we would manipulate the flow regime, and we studied how the food web would assemble across the season. I don't have final results this, but I really wanted to plug some of the preliminary results. We found whole ecosystem response. We saw that production increased in agreement with the treatment. Okay, this early flow, 6 weeks before it should peak, correlated with a peak in GPP and also respiration, probably driven by increased temperatures, right? Like low flow, the streams became warmer. And something, now we are analyzing emergence data. Something that's interesting is that we saw that this early flow treatment, because emergence increased so much, attracted birds, brewers, blackbirds that would feed in the emergent, on the emerging insects. So that was pretty unexpected and something that worth considering. Again, like this is not just the aquatic habitat, this may ripple through terrestrial food webs. So I will show more on this soon. We don't have more results, but Kyle is making progress. There's a range of other related topics in the lab that I will not discuss today. Most of us and most of the postdocs and PhD students in the lab work on a range of questions. All of these have something to do with flow regimes, whether it's drought or interannual variation in flows, wet and dry years, or altered flows by dams, and how communities and food webs respond to that. So I just wanted to say that I'm very happy with how things are going in the lab, I think that we are together pushing forward really this program. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. And this is a photo of our last gathering, the socially distanced lab meeting we had a couple months ago. So thank you, and I will take any questions.
All right, thank you very much for the talk, Albert. If someone has a question, you can raise your hand and I could try and find you, or you could also, excuse me, you could also write a chat in the box and I will read it. So there is one question in the chat box, so I'll go ahead and ask that one. So usually regional scale reservoir management models consider environmental flow constraint as a single constraint in multi-objective studies. Can hydropeaking and its effect on different species can be used to better inform the hydrological models?
This is a really good question, Sudarshan. Thanks. I think so, but I think we are not there yet. As you know, most research happens at the local reservoir level, but it would be really interesting. As you know, some of the work we have been advancing with CICIN or with a Powell Center working group led by Sankar Harumugam. So we are trying to understand how flow alteration propagates across the network, right? That's the fact that the headwaters are altered. Does that mean that the rest of the main stem will be altered, or can a free-flowing tributary restore main stem conditions? It's an interesting area of research. I think there's very little, and I don't think there's anything in the context of hydropeaking. But I think it would be really interesting to connect this with meta population models to see, okay, maybe we can spare one of the tributaries and not hydropeak there, and hope that that population will rescue the rest of the meta population. I think it would be really interesting, especially for invertebrates that can fly and could recolonize the network even if the dam is still there, even if there's fragmentation. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we should talk about this more.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So the next question in the chat box is, hello, Albert. What is known about the effects of flow variation in aquatic communities and tropical streams?
Okay, well, it's a good question too. It's a bit open-ended, and I'm not an expert in tropical streams. Coincidentally, last week we had Checo Colon Gaut at Berkeley presenting in the ESPAM seminar series, and he showed some interesting research on food webs, and particularly in these streams that are dominated by shrimp, that some are filter feeders or predators, and how that affects secondary production, because because they are not insects, right? So there's not immersion, and then any change in production stays in the river, doesn't emerge. So anyway, I think there's a lot known, and I don't think I'm an expert in that. I would say that the importance of signal and noise, right? This idea that disturbance, whether it needs to be predictable or not, and that has been a debate in the 80s as well. But that is an interesting question to ask in tropical streams, because they are less seasonal, right? More stable over the year, but they can still be subject to hurricanes and large scale disturbance. So I think the same kind of questions that we are asking here in the American West, California, would be really interesting to ask in tropical streams, where your relative influence of seasonality and stochastic variation is really swapped. So I don't know if that answers the question. Hopefully it gives you some food for thought.
Thank you, Albert.
All right, so I have a question. So I thought it was interesting when you showed that map at the beginning of your slide from the Voro-Smarty paper, the global map looking at biodiversity risk versus water scarcity risk, how the U.S. had zero water scarcity risk, but lots of biodiversity risk, right? And of course, a lot of that is due to the fact that the U.S. has a lot of dams in rivers that help, prevent water scarcity from happening in the U.S. But as other nations across the world start to build these dams, to improve their water security, especially in the face of climate change, right? I guess are there any lessons that we're learning in the U.S. in how we might be able to change or manage the way we build dams or release their flows in ways that could potentially reduce their impacts elsewhere?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in the US, the go years of dam building are over, right? But there's still some dam building, and there's a lot of retrofitting, and more so projected, in the coming decade with, linked to green energy. So I think it's really important to, dams are not like, I don't think they solve, long-term problems of water scarcity, because just they allow you to draw more water, right? And you end up with a more efficient system that captures everything, but also more vulnerable, right? And we have seen this in California when like the drought hit, there's a ton of storage, but if the system is over allocated, that the storage will not help. So I hope that we are learning that message, that more storage, if you are still using, all of it, that will not build resilience. It will just make you more vulnerable, actually, to this interannual variation that we cannot control. In terms of reoperation, I think that interesting things are happening. Like some countries are really advancing that. I read about Japan, for example, how they need to, like show how like whenever they build a new dam or retrofit one, they need to show that management is flexible, and they need to consider different reoperation strategies. And this idea of designer flows, I think it's one that's exciting. As of now, I think it's more an idea, or it's in the realm of ideas and not so much practice. But I would hope that that we start managing better rather than building more. I think that would be my message.
It's a really interesting point. I actually didn't think about that, how it doesn't actually improve long-term water security, but making it even more vulnerable because you're used to having it. So it's interesting. Exactly. Any other questions for Albert?
I should add that everything I talked about is flow, but of course flow is not, we consider flow to be this master variable, as Bob puts it. But there are many other dimensions of the environmental or an ecosystem that matter. Some of them are correlated with flow, some of them co-vary with flow, some of them don't co-vary with flow, and they're just independent. But it's also interesting to think that flow alone doesn't restore everything, right? There's thermal alteration and sediments and metabolism. There's so many dimensions that with a temperature alteration, there's also interesting things going on with like multi-level intakes where they can decide, what's the right temperature to release water. But it's still, I think it's very incipient. Like we are only starting to grasp what we can do.
Okay, a couple more questions in the chat box. So have you done much work with river systems that have multiple dams on them? Like, do you see compounding effects of flow when you have sort of dams upstream of other dams?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have done a single paper and included there. We should submit soon. And I know like some of you are from this working group that are really hoping that I will submit it soon, and I will. So it is in the Colorado River, we address this idea on spatial dependency, how the flow regime propagates. And we have seen both. We have seen cumulative effects, but also a small or weak suggestion that flow regimes can be spatially restored if a free-flowing tributary joins an altered, a very flat flow regime in a main stem. So yeah, there's very little on this, and I think it's very interesting because it's not just, most of my talk was on time, right? But there's space and time, and I think we need to understand flow regimes, how they vary over space and how they interact. And I think this question is spot on. I think in general they have, compounding or cumulative effects, but it would be really interesting to see how you could, spatially prioritize the ones that keep network level, flow regimes like more natural or more seasonal. So thanks.
Dan,
I
you're
cannot
muted.
hear you then.
Sorry. Another question from the chat box is, one of your case studies was on the ACF, the Apalachicola Flint River Basin in Florida, Georgia, Alabama. As you know, the system is the subject of a decades-long water war between these three states. Previously, much of the federal management has focused simply on minimum daily flows, but this is likely insufficient. How would you think we could sell a more holistic flow management to states like Georgia that are resistant to it?
Yeah, this is also a very good question and very complicated one, right? And yeah, so I was aware about these battles in the ACF, and actually that plot I showed in the Chattahoochee, apparently that was the source of a legal battle. Apparently, like a gauge had been recording, or they thought there was like the water level in the reservoir in Lake Lanier was higher than it actually was, and that caused like a huge legal battle. So really interesting, really not my topic, but it's interesting to see how how this compounds. In terms of selling the flow regime and not just minimum flows, that has been, I think, a challenge for many years since Poff's paper in the natural flow regime. He already made that point that like we understand flow as a minimum requirement and really should be more than that. I don't know what could be done to sell more this idea. I think that we can all understand that it really matters when you release the flow, right? And maybe actually, if we have rigorous methods to show that in general we need more water, but it's not always the case. Like sometimes we need the same amount of water, but at the right time. Maybe that would be a good way to sell the message, that it's not more water per se, is being smart about when you should release it. Maybe that could be a selling argument.
Yeah. Okay, one more question. How important do you think designer prescriptive flows will be in the future for managing for biodiversity conservation, especially with climate change and the continued decline of freshwater species?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a very tense debate, I would say, like in stream ecology and like fish biologists and ecologists, I think have pushed back in general against the idea that designer flows will, mitigate impacts of dams. And on the other hand, we have engineers like pushing for. We have frameworks that are trying to reconcile both views. We have this idea of eco-engineering, decision scaling. I really don't know. I think that this is more in these are ideas. I think there are some reasons to be optimistic, but I also think that it's very hard if your goal is to preserve biodiversity, like as a whole, like your question suggests. I think that's very hard to achieve because there are many trade-offs, right? If you, you could maybe manage dams in a ways that benefit or do not harm, particular species that you care about that are listed or have, some ecosystem service associated with them, but trying to preserve biodiversity or whole communities, I think that's very tricky. There's some papers showing why this is tricky, because they differ in generation times, because of different sensitivity to stress, and again, not just flow. There's a paper by Jonathan King, Dave Lytle, Julian Alden, and others showing this, like these trade-offs between riparian plants, insects, and fish. So I think it's very hard. I hope that we can, like, more science, of course, will help, but I'm also a bit skeptical, like this will not be a one-fits-all solution.
Okay, any other questions for Albert? All right, I think that's it. Hey, Albert, that's a really cool talk. Thank you so much for coming by and sharing with us. I'm sorry you're not here in person, but hopefully, you know, maybe we can, maybe another 5 or 6 years, you can come back and you can show us the results of all the studies that you're alluding to. So thanks a lot, Albert.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, and thanks all for coming and asking questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And there was a lot of applauding, like the little applause in the Zoom. It's always strange to end and just have it be silent. So
I know.
yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for all your questions. And for our seminar series, we will be having another great talk next week, same time. So thank you again very much.
Laura,
Bye.
we really ought to get a clap soundtrack.
We really should. Maybe I'll just start adding it. I need to get a laugh track too for when people make jokes, because that's always real awkward.
All right.
All right.
Bye-bye.